Moi aussi, je voudrais commencer.
I would also like to start by thanking the Auschwitz Foundation for giving me the opportunity to present my work about the Jewish resistance in the death camps of Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka. This is a topic that has very seldomly been touched upon in the French, German and English historiography of the Shoah. Already, when it is touched upon the camps of Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, academics, French-speaking academics, most of the times only preface the historical sources. Most of the time they publish the testimony of a survivor. Sometimes it can also be a series of documents such as the investigation research of the investigative judge of the investigation on Hermann Höfler, one of the local people in charge of the Reinhardt operation. So in these death centers, you cannot say there is a real debate between historians, because on a given topic we don't have a variety of studies based on the same archive documents. The history of these death centers is almost abandoned to negationist circles that are the only ones to show interest to these sites. The main works carried out on the death camps are still the Shmuel Krakowski book and the one of Itzhak Arad for Operation Reinhardt. Krakowski deals with the Chelmno website. They are both historians but also witnesses. They are Israeli writers. They survived the genocide before they could write the history of the genocide. Shmuel Krakowski is rescued from Auschwitz, while Itzhak Arad fought in the Lithuanian forests with the partisans. So these works show at the same time the genocide policy and the Jewish resistance in the death camps. This is quite exceptional in the historiography of the Shoah, where researchers are divided between the group of historians of the final solution and those of the memory of the genocide. So my presentation is prepared on the basis of a PhD thesis that I presented in 2007 in La Sorbonne University, and it's part of the pioneering works of Shmuel Krakowski and Itzhak Arad. It's based on these works. It's also based on some investigation carried out by independent researchers that are not connected to any particular university. And I'm thinking especially of the research of Michael Tregrenze, who is the only writer on the only monography on the Belzec camp until it was published recently, the study of Robert Kowalek and Robin O'Neill. At the same time, the historiography has shown a number of works. One was published in 1964 in Stuttgart and has a rather legal basis and approach. You have the study of Reinhard Henkes, die nationalsozialistischen Gewaltverbrechen, Geschichte und Gericht. So why were historians reluctant to focusing their studies on Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka camps and on resistance, Jewish resistance in particular? Well, for very long these death camps were considered as ahistorical places that were out of the reach of any historical studies. So the researchers always asked this following question: what could be said about sites that were only built to a sole goal, the one that was to murder massively men, women and children from a Jewish background. And an emeritus professor of the Princeton University, Arno J. Meyer, presented the 4 death camps as a theater without a stage, a place without any particular events, where you couldn't identify the executors of the genocide, nor the victims that were presented as an anonymous mass. At the same time, a large number of historians considered that it was impossible to write the story of Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka just because there were apparently no archives or no witnesses. So is it really impossible to write the history of the death camps because of the lack of sources? Well, in fact, two sources of archives have enabled me to find concrete traces on Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka. The first one comes from the legal investigations from the west of Germany of the Zentrale Stelle of Ludwigsburg. It's a legal institution founded in 1958 by the Federal Republic of Germany, and its main task was to carry out the preliminary investigation of Nazi crimes. So this source has amongst its documents some of the minutes of the interviews of the executors of the genocide, the testimonies of survivors and depositions of German, Ukrainian and Polish witnesses that lived closely to these death camps, and also documents of crucial importance, legal documents, such as, for example, the German translation of the reports drafted by Polish magistrates on the inspection that they had carried out as in the wake of the Nazi occupation on the abandoned death camps. Despite this data being very varied and wide, the legal sources are somehow causing some problems because the investigative judges are carrying out the investigations with, first of all, the objective to show the individual involvement of suspects in Nazi crimes. When they are facing an important figure, such as an executor, a survivor, or a witness, they are focusing on precise points that can enable them to determine the extent of the suspect's guilt. And they're not really trying to rebuild the history of the Jewish resistance. This is not their task, and at the same time the second archive source is the Literatur, that is the Yiddish literature of destruction. This is made up of testimonies from survivors, journalist investigation on Nazi crimes, and also literary works published in the wake of the war in the Yiddish language. You also have examples of historical work on the Jewish genocide, and based on this, you realize that death camps are dynamic spaces whose topography changes as the genocide also evolves, and the daily life on this death camp doesn't just mean the arrival of victim convoys and the departure of empty wagons. And as Abraham Goldfarb shows, Abraham Goldfarb is a survivor of Treblinka, and he said in 1960, during his hearing by the Israeli police in Petah Tikva, every day in the Treblinka camp was a particular chapter of the history of the annihilation of the Jewish people. I'm unable to say everything that I saw at the time, because I would have then to describe every single second in the camp. That wouldn't be possible. In Treblinka, there was not a single second without events. For this reason, I will only keep to these events that were deeply enshrined in my memory. So these sources that I just mentioned enables historians to find enough traces regarding death camps. And most of all, they clearly show that you can put a name on these anonymous faces of the Arbeitsjuden, or that you can actually identify the executors. So what can we say about Jewish resistance based on these very fragmented sources? Well, in the past we were asking the following questions. How an SS Sonderkommando made up of about 20 executors could assassinate thousands of Jews just with a team of 150 to 200 guards? And why did these thousands of Jews did not show any opposition to the Nazis? You find these questions in several sources. For example, the first report published in Treblinka in February 1943, and Dietrich Zeug, an investigative judge of Western Germany who led the investigation on the Reinhardt operation in Ludwigsburg, writes with great surprise in his report of November 1960 how these gassing operations were made possible. And a former police officer of the Sonderkommando of Chelmno testified in front of the investigative judge in 1961 in Bonn that the SS Sonderkommando Kulmhof didn't need to resort to violence. Jewish deportees, if they had wanted to, could have fought the Germans. So today it is accepted that there was some Jewish resistance in the ghettos and in the Nazi camps. But it cannot be said that the history of Jewish resistance is well known. Historians tend to touch upon this topic only basing themselves on a partial amount of the available sources. This is why when you read the historiography of the Shoah, the Jewish resistance in the death camps is very often presented as an act of despair instead of an organized project. When one compares the fragmented traces of the Jewish resistance in the 4 death centers, one can list the following points. The first reaction of a deportee that has just been integrated in an Arbeitsjuden team is despair. This is usually the case when he came to the camp with his family. Usually suicide is the first reaction. Then some oral sources, such as interviews of former members of the SS Sonderkommando, the testimonies of survivors or the depositions of Polish witnesses, all mention the existence of spontaneous resistance actions. Philipp Friedman, one of the first Shoah historians, says that spontaneous actions define the will to oppose the Nazi will. For example, you can quote the sabotage of the genocide, attacking a member of the SS Sonderkommando, or simply refusing to perform such or such action. Such actions are usually not planned. They cannot have an influence on history. The genocide is not interrupted after a spontaneous resistance acts. And most of the times we don't even know the names of the authors of these acts. So when we found the trace of such an act, immediately the authors are immediately killed. And George Wellers in 1949, writing about Jewish resistance in general, said that in the history of Shoah, indeed, there are many acts of bravery and courage whose authors will forever remain anonymous. I'd like to quote him on telling the story of Meyer Berliner, who attacked the SS Unterscharführer Max Biala in September 1942 in Treblinka. It was an action committed by an Arbeitsjude, and therefore we know his name, Meyer Berliner. It's a Jew with the Argentinian nationality who was in Warsaw at the beginning of the war. He attacked Max Biala during a call while this executor was selecting Arbeitsjuden either to kill them or to send them to the gas chambers. There are different versions on this point. Max Biala died of his his stab wound while he was being taken to a better equipped military hospital. And therefore the SS Sonderkommando was decided to assassinate Meyer Berliner, so the author of the attack, but also decided to shoot about 100 Arbeitsjuden, following the principle of collective responsibility. And this is always the case when the SS Sonderkommando faces a resistance act, whether it's successful or not. The members of the commando, of the author of the action, are also punished. But this is not enough to put down the resistance initiatives among the teams of Arbeitsjuden. The detainees, the Jewish detainees, also managed to bind back with life thanks to solidarity that they find at the heart of the Arbeitsjuden's team. Richard Glaser, a person rescued from Treblinka, explained on this point that it was impossible for a Jewish detainee to survive on his own in a death camp. It's slightly different from concentration camp on this point. You had to be part of a group of 2 or 3 people, even more, because it was important to benefit from mutual help in the camp, for food, for example. Also, when a detainee was ill, he had to be concealed and looked after. Only one category was excluded from this network, the members of the Jewish police of the ghettos. Glaser even says in the same deposition that the capos in Treblinka were making sure these police officers would get the worst possible jobs in the camp, and they were not particularly welcome by the rest of the team. And often they decided to commit suicide. They didn't make it very long because of these conditions in the death camps. The Arbeitsjuden are therefore clinging on to life. But it's worth stressing that the resistance will of an Arbeitsjude was immediately put off when he met the corpses or his family, or his family alive. Facing the situation, the detainee was only thinking of committing suicide. You have the example of Michael Bochlebnik, a person that had survived Chelmno, who says the story at the beginning of Shoah, the film of Claude Lanzmann. When he was in charge of pulling the bodies out of a gas truck in the forest, he noticed his wife, his 7-year-old son and his 5-year-old daughter, and he immediately asked an SS to be shot. But instead of shooting him, the SS hit him and then pushed him to continue with his work. And in the evening of this terrible day, Michael Bochlebnik still wanted to commit suicide, but his friends and his team decided to support him and managed to keep him alive. They told him, you can always opt for suicide, but by staying alive you may have a possibility to flee Chelmno and to take your revenge. Otherwise, the idea of uprise or rebellion is often preceded by attempts to flee. Arbeitsjuden think increasingly of individual flights or flights in a little group, in a limited group. In 1942, their objective is still to alert the Jewish communities of the Nazi intention, the total annihilation of the Jewish people. They also think that the free world is not aware of these crimes, and they hope to trigger a reaction, an intervention from the Allies. So, early 1943, the Arbeitsjuden have no hope left. And this is probably why the last team is finally named the Testament of the Last Jewish Prisoners of Chelmno. It's a text that was written by Israel Ziddelman while he was expecting the liquidation of the camp a week before, 9th of January 1945. Israel Ziddelman wanted to write the message of each of the 47 Jewish detainees, but then he wanted to write a column like the columnist of Birkenau had done. But finally, he had to keep to briefly describing a number of examples of crimes having been experienced in Chelmno, while reporting all the names of the SS and police officers working on the site. Finally, the Arbeitsjuden also abandoned their attempts to flee, to instead dedicate themselves to a rebellion. Anyway, the attempts to flee were usually unsuccessful, and every time they were followed by the assassination of part of the Arbeitsjuden that remained in the camp as a revenge. So the idea of rebellion becomes more concrete when the Arbeitsjuden understand that a spontaneous resistance action has no chance to succeed. So the detainees are starting to envisage a more organized act, and several rebellion projects are started. We only know those who have been developed by the last rebellion committees in Sobibor and Treblinka. The members of these committees who mentioned the rebellion attempts and that have been aborted. What is important is that it's possible still to find some traces, fragmented traces, linked to the history of the Jewish resistance, because the SS Sonderkommando decided to form more stable Arbeitsjuden teams, because it was more difficult to always integrate new deputies who didn't know the camp. So in the interest of the genocide policy, once they had a stable Sonderkommando, they would keep them longer alive. And this is why it was easier to find traces reporting the same event. Several different sources to comment on one same event. So I will not develop further on rebellions, but I can say that some of these rebellions had a utopic aspect, but they were following two main objectives in Sobibor and Treblinka. The first one was to put an end or to destroy the death camp, and the second one was to allow at least a number of Arbeitsjuden to flee, so that at least some of them could be able to survive and tell what had been experienced in the camps. And all of the rebellion committees had to face the question of finding weapons. This was also the case in the ghettos. The Arbeitsjuden were alone in this project. They were supported neither by the local population nor by the different Polish resistance group. They tried to get some weapons with the help of Ukrainian guards. These guards are allowed to leave the camp. They accept to give the Arbeitsjuden cigarettes, food or newspapers in exchange for a lot of money or valuables, but they do not support the resistance acts and therefore do not provide for weapons. So how did they solve this problem? In Treblinka or in Sobibor, the rebellion plan had to include a way to find weapons in Treblinka or in Sobibor. They had to find a trick. They managed to duplicate the key for the weapon warehouse. And at the beginning of the rebellion, they create an attack team that will attack the weapon warehouse. But despite this project, the Arbeitsjuden also have to make their own weapons. They had to have makeshift knives, makeshift axes, because they have a very important lack of weapons to do so. The cases are different in Reno and Belzec. These two camps are not like the others. They are not clearly fenced. there are two isolated sites, the castle and the forest, and there are then ordinary parts of the Chelmno village that are integrated in the camp. And the weapon warehouse was not placed where the officers were staying, and this is why in Chelmno as well as in Belzec, the officers, the Arbeitsjuden didn't manage to get to these weapons. And in both cases, the only way to come out of a death camp was to flee. They attempted to do so on the day Chelmno was liquidated, Belzec's liquidation. So what turned out of the rebellions? Some of the survivors of Treblinka describe it as not being a success. They don't consider themselves as heroes. But can we say it was just an act of despair, a last-minute act of despair? Even if Arbeitsjuden didn't manage to reach all their objectives, the labs of Sobibor and the rebellions of Sobibor and Treblinka were started spontaneously, but then they didn't manage to implement the whole project. So it was quite anarchic way to develop their projects. It wasn't following a clear order, but they managed to change the story because the Nazi authorities were not yet planning to liquidate these camps in summer and in the fall in 1943. We have oral sources showing that there were construction works carrying on both sides the day before the rebellions. And Himmler's personal office, as well as other sources, clearly showed that the Nazi authorities had planned to transform the death camp of Sobibor in a concentration camp. Then the local authorities requested for him to do something else, and Himmler agreed to keep Sobibor as a pure death camp, but integrating one function that was to sort the goods confiscated to the Soviet army. So they give up this idea of making it a mixed camp where you have concentration and death. And the gassing operations within the framework of the Reinhardt operation practically stopped after the revolts. Both convoys coming from Białystok seem to be taking place in Treblinka because of the uprise of Białystok, and it seems that the Nazi authorities didn't manage to implement the they wanted to solve the problem as quickly as possible. And finally, and most importantly, several hundreds of Arbeitsjuden managed to free themselves thanks to rebellions. This is about 300 detainees for Sobibor and 400 people who were rescued for Treblinka. This figure is based on oral sources. About a few dozens of them didn't manage to survive the war. Sorry, I have 5 minutes to finish. So I'd like to finish by giving you an example on the death camp, or at least the death station in Auschwitz-Birkenau that I often mention during my classes at university. It is the Zentrale Stelle of Ludwigsburg that is investigating on Nazi crimes. At the beginning of the 80s, it gets a letter of denunciation, a reporting letter that is anonymous, and this letter asks the Western German magistrates to open an investigation on Philipp Müller, a survivor of the Sonderkommando of Auschwitz that is living at the time in Mannheim. This letter is written in a very violent anti-Semitic style, and Philipp Müller is accused of having killed himself Jewish deportees in the gassing chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So the letter is so detailed that you wonder if the anonymous author wasn't himself an executor in this death station in Auschwitz. So based on the letter, a West German judge opens the investigation, but it's probably the shortest ever investigation existing in the archives of the Zentrale Stelle. Normally, a legal investigation in Ludwigsburg can be made up of dozens of binders, but for Philipp Müller's case, there are only 5 to 6 pages, because the investigative judge in charge of the investigation stopped the investigation after finding the testimony of Philipp Müller that had been published in 1979 in Germany. Without this testimony, the investigation would probably have continued, and the accused could have said how the Jews could have resisted, but decided not to resist the Nazi genocide. So the former members of SS Sonderkommando, when they're facing accusations of rescue people within legal investigations, can no longer hide behind strategies to prove their innocence. In their own interest, they have to give correct information on their involvement of the crimes. But in any event, this question is still open. We still need to research and debate on this question.